And a very good afternoon to listeners here in Anguilla, across the Caribbean and the rest of the world. We want to welcome you to the first in two roundtables that will be featuring here on Radio Anguilla as we pay our respects to the late Honorable former Chief Minister Hubert Benjamin Hughes, the man and his politics. Today we'll be focusing mainly on our local politicians and other persons who are very close to Mr. Hughes. Joining me in studio today is Glenn Hodge, our resident historian, someone who's been very politically astute, has been following the politics of Anguilla for a very long time. We have Mr. Hughes's older brother, very happy to have him, James Freddie Hughes, very good to have you in here. We have Mr. Edison Beard, former minister, former honorable minister, served with Mr. Hughes. And we also have Mr. Hughes' opponent in District Number 6, the Honorable Curtis Richardson, who was served in the Anguilla Parliament, served in government as well, was a minister of government as well. So Mr. Beard and Mr. Richardson are both former government ministers. We expect the Premier, Honorable Dr. Ellis Webster, to join us, and we'll be joined as well by Minas Hodge on the phone, Josephine Gums. We'll be hopefully having Mr. Walcott Richardson, former minister, Mr. Brent Davis. Those are the persons who we are hoping to get with us on the program. It's a round table, so we'll be talking. And firstly, let me go across to Mr. Beard. Let me start with you and to just get you to tell us a bit, share with us a bit about the late former Chief Minister Hubert Hughes, your work with him, your work against him, your time with him in government, out of government, your reflections on the late former Chief Minister, Mr. Beard.
Well, I'm from the village of Sandy Ground, and when I was a teenager, Mr. Hughes was not popular in Sandy Ground. And he came to Sandy Ground and he gave me his bullhorn. And I went up and down the village announcing his meeting. It felt good. And I said a few words. To be truthful, I can't recall what I said. But I recall him calling me over, and there were people around, and he said, "You talk good." So I felt very important. I came into contact with him again. At this time, I was going to the Bastille Senior School in St. Kitts, and I would come to Anguilla for my holidays. And I came down on his boat, the St. Andrew. We went from St. Kitts to St. Bart's, from St. Bart's to Anguilla. But nobody slept because it appeared as if the St. Andrew was designed to stop people from sleeping. It was high-sided and it rolled from one part to the next, and Mr. Hughes and I, naturally by this time, we talked politics. Then I went off to the States, to Canada, to get an education. I came back and I ran as a member of the Anguilla Democratic Party. And he had his party, the Anguilla United Movement. And his candidate for the Road North constituency was Mr. Restamel Franklin. And it was very humorous because Restamel Franklin said, "This is Restamel Franklin, your pilot, your captain." He was a pilot. And I said, "I just don't understand Mr. Restamel's line of reasoning, because he's a pilot, he has a plane, but there's no airport in Sandy Ground for him to land. No airport in Northfield, no airport in Southfield, and he didn't land because I won the election." Anyway, Mr. Hughes and I, we came together again because by the 1994 election, the Anguilla Democratic Party, which was headed by Mr. Banks, it won 2 seats, Mr. Banks' seat and my seat. And the Anguilla United Movement, which was headed by Mr. Hughes, it won 2 seats, the late Albert Hughes' seat, West End, and Mr. Hughes, of course, would naturally win his seat. So the two parties, mysterious, and I use the one mysteriously with great caution, came together and we said, look, the only way to come to power is to put aside our differences. And I was involved in the discussions because I didn't beat my opponent by much. So I wasn't looking at going back to any polls. I said, look, we need to farm this government. And we farmed the government. And Mr. Hughes said to me, you have an education, so we're going to put you in education. I said, okay, I'll go in education. I didn't expect to have any of the big portfolios. I didn't expect to get tourism. I didn't expect to get finance. Those were for the senior politicians. I'd never been elected before. And they gave my cue to Mr. Hughes. We had no disagreement whatsoever in respect of the distribution of the ministries. And we worked well together. Nobody was a dictator. And nobody was a dictator for two reasons. If, for example, if I got carried away, three of them would restrain me. If Mr. Hughes got carried away, three of us would restrain him. And there was another restraint that helped us considerably. Every member of the government knew that not a single member of the opposition under any consideration would join the government. Therefore, we were four mountain climbers tied together, and nobody was going to help us. So we had to work together. And I have said it publicly. I'm saying it here, and I'll say it tomorrow. The 1994 to the 1999 government was the best government Angola has ever had. And I'll go further and say is likely to have for a long time. Mr. Hughes was the chief minister. He was a steady hand and he provided guidance. But he never tried to impose himself on us, whether it was due to the restraints or a change in his disposition, I don't know. But that 1994-99 government, we did a lot of work in education, we did a lot of work in health. Look at the infrastructure. It was easily the most progressive government this country has ever had.
But things were not always rosy, fine and dandy. And I want to take you back to July the 8th of 2013, during your last stint with the Honorable Hubert Hughes in office. And I want to play a clip, and then after the clip I want you to comment. It had to do with your fallout and your eventual sacking by the same Hubert Hughes. For what he claimed and other members of the party claimed were your non-attendance of key pre-exco minutes. Let's get that clip.
I was constantly accused of holding up government business because I argued that we must not put the cart before the horse in terms of decision making. Any view expressed by me that did not fall in line with that of the chief minister was shouted down, especially by party members. No sensible course of action for the steering of government business was ever reached at any of these meetings. These meetings typically ended in confusion. They lacked order, and it appeared to me as though it were a group of children somewhere on a playing field kicking ball and hollering at each other. I also sensed that people wanted to be loose about decision making and did not care to put the proper machinery in place that would allow us to do the people's business in the right way. My good conscience did not allow me to. I therefore made sure to indicate to the chief minister that this style of decision making was unworkable and that there was a need to change it in the interest of moving the country forward. I emphasized that in the new arrangement he should chair the meetings. After all, he was the leader of government business. He was elected to bring about positive change in this country. I am no longer part of the government and therefore can no longer be wrongfully accused of holding up government projects. I quote without prejudice words which have appeared on a billboard on the airport road. Quote, "Now that Eddie is gone, what's next, CM?" End of quote.
Okay, so 94
to 99. That's the government I'm talking about.
Right, but you came back in government with him
in 2010.
In 2010.
Yes.
You had some rocky feelings
Oh, yes,
there
yes,
led
yeah.
to your sacking,
Yeah.
and hence your public comment. You came out and responded.
Yes.
I just want you to share with us now some of the rocky periods you've gone through with the former chief minister, and how you were able to maneuver and play along in that sort of setting.
Let me point out that there were several bones of contention. One of the things I objected to is that the government at that time was acting outside of the Executive Council. Memorandums of understanding were being signed without the knowledge of certain ministers of government. And all I merely said to the Chief Minister, you need to operate within the confines of the Executive Council, because if you don't operate within the confines of the Executive Council, you're playing in the hands of the governor. Another bone of contention, they refer to these pre-cabinet meetings. They want no cabinet meetings as such. Mr. Hughes never chaired the meetings. The meetings was held at House X, and you would have 20, 30 people. And the minute the meeting started, everybody started to attack me. One of the guys said that he is going to set up a committee to oversee my ministry. I find this ludicrous. And the guy is not the most educated guy in the world.
But overall, Mr. Beard, what's your lasting memory serving in government, being associated in politics as you did for almost 2 decades, in Anguilla, and serving alongside Hubert?
Mr. Hughes is the only chief minister that I've ever served under. First government, second government, the third government. And my seat was always critical to the formation of the government. Mr. Hughes and I didn't have any problems as such. There were certain people outside the government who wanted to dictate instructions to the ministers of government. And I said I wasn't elected to be instructed. I take orders from the chief minister. I don't take lawyers from A and B who wanted to use the Executive Council to further their professional careers and their businesses. That was a bone of a contention, that people outside of Executive Council, they were obsessed with dictating the course of government business to government, and I objected to that.
Eddie Beard, we want to thank you. Let's get close to the family member, his older brother, James Freddie Hughes. Mr. Hughes, your more illustrious brother has departed, has left us. Share with us memories that you had as his older brother growing up in Southfield. What was he like as a young man growing up in Southfield? Share with us those very special moments.
Well, growing up as a boy, he always let us know that he is interested in getting an education, and the kind of education he wanted wasn't available in Anguilla. And I, being the older brother, I was able to finance him through school, grammar school in St. Kitts. Because I quit sailing and went to work in Aruba, and by doing that, helped me to be able to finance him through her grammar school in St. Kitts. And he went there, and apparently he did alright. Then, when he was finished with grammar school, he got a job in customs in St. Kitts. He worked for a short time, and after that, when people were migrating to England, he decided to go. And all his talk was parliamentary procedures. You know, he wanted to study something about parliamentary procedures.
Did he always have this love for politics? He always had that desire to get involved politically. He loved politics.
Yes, especially he studied African history.
African history.
And so whenever he come, he could tell you about everybody, all what happened in any part of Africa when any conversation arise. And especially the time when there was some problem with Ian Smith and
Rhodesia.
Rhodesia. You know, it was very worse on that. And at that time, when he came back from England and he ran the first time, I don't think he succeeded. But we decided, I kept him under my wings and we bought a
How did you manage to keep him under your wings?
I bought a small ship together and bring him in as a part owner. We were part owners of a boat, you know, and I teach him as much as I know of sailing. I taught him to be a captain. And
Was he a good skipper? Was he a good captain?
well, not the best, not the best, but he was able to make out, find his way around, such as what I show him, because at that time I did a little navigation and I show him how to do dead reckoning, like taking courses by the chart, using the chart in the parallel rule, and measuring distances and so on, and how to know what he's doing when he, after losing sight of land and so. And
Yeah, go ahead.
When we arrive in ports, and I have to send him anywhere to buy parts for the boat or anything, and he meets somebody that he can talk politics with, I may as well go and look for it again because he ain't coming back. So he would spend the rest of the day talking politics with somebody, and that would put me out of what I had to do because I was strictly about maintaining the boat, you know.
In the family setting, was he a talkative, aggressive, when I say aggressive, not physically aggressive, but was he that kind of, because he was bigger than life, he was very forceful in his pronouncement. Was he always like that in the family setting, or he grew into that as he got older and got more actively involved in politics? Was he always that kind of a person?
He was that way. He was that way, and you know, and being the youngest brother, he was supported to be what he wanted to be. So the sisters, he only had one sister that was after him, and everybody supported him, and he had the privilege to be whatever he wanted to be, according to our affordance.
Very interesting indeed. I think we can go to our, just hold a while, Mr. Hughes. I think we can go to our telephone line. We have the Reverend Minas Hodge, who's come up online with us here. And Reverend Hodge was his principal assistant secretary when Mr. Hughes came into government. And he also indicated to me that while he was in Colombia for his medical treatment, in fact, Mr. Hughes then requested that Reverend Minas Hodge gave him a call and he prayed for Mr. Hughes. So, good afternoon to you, Reverend.
Good afternoon, sir.
Yes, just share with us your thoughts, your memories of the late Honorable Chief Minister Hubert Benjamin Hughes.
Right, okay. To start with, my first post in the Chief Minister's office was Principal Assistant Secretary, the first person in Anguilla to hold that post. So when Mr. Hughes came Chief Minister, replacing Sir Emile, I was the first person had the privilege of welcoming Mr. Hughes to the physical part of the Chief Minister's business in Anguilla. So from that day on, we both established a cordial working relationship, both in and out of office. Mr. Hughes had a good sense of humor that served him well in interpersonal relationships, both in and out of the office. So I recall that he was a very friendly person. He seemed to have had the interest of people at heart, and that heart of the Anguillian magazine, a newspaper, Mr. Hughes told that to tell me to please give him a call. The call was made, and Mr. Hughes said he was glad to hear my voice and asked that I should please pray with and for him. I was pleased with such a request, and there and then I began to intercede on his behalf before the throne of grace. I asked for God's blessings on him, and I assured him that I will continue to remember him in prayers, which I never failed to do. May his soul rest in perpetual peace and rise in eternal glory. Here, I wish to extend deepest sympathies to Mrs. Hughes, to his son, the Honorable Hayden, and to all other family members, from my entire family members in Angola and abroad. I trust that all will go well with all who are concerned over his passing. God bless you all.
Thank you so very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Reverend Minas Hodge, for your contribution. Thank you so very much. All right, we've been joined by the Honorable Premier, Dr. Ellis Lorenzo Webster. We want to welcome you as well, sir, to the program here today. But I want to go, before I get to the Premier, I want to go across to Honorable Curtis Richardson, former Minister of Communications and Works in the last government. And Mr. Richardson, you came up against Mr. Hughes in District Number 6. You were unsuccessful. You felt the full force of the man's power and the love by the people in District 6 for him. Share with us your memories of the late former Chief Minister Hubert Benjamin Hughes. Mr. Richardson.
Yes, well, good afternoon to everyone. I found that Mr. Hughes, people often misjudged him politically. I think that he took politics very seriously. I found out in running against him in 2 elections that he was very crafty. He was a guy that knew the community well. He was very versed in the dynamics of people. And I say that because my father was a very strong supporter of Mr. Hughes just before I decided to contest the elections against him. One of the things, the only thing probably that I faulted him for was that within the community itself, I did not see the evidence of his representation. So that was why I decided to get into politics, and I decided to go from the community into a national.
So you would not have run against him? You never had no real intention to run against him?
Well,
he was such a powerful figure in that Number 6.
Yes, he had a very disciplined and a dedicated approach, which I grew to understand over time, trying to run against him. And I'll share 2 instances with you, something that a lot of people, including myself, cannot get it done. Mr. Hughes would go to the Methodist church for 7 o'clock. He would leave from the Methodist church, being in the a full service. He would leave from there on a Sunday and come to my dad's church and stay for whatever duration the service went for. That is not something easily done, and he did not do it one Sunday in a month. He did it every single Sunday in every single month. Yeah? And he was very dedicated, he was very disciplined, because I tried to study him and see where he got this passion that the people had for him. I remembered some years ago, I said that this is something that I will try to do, because I noticed that he would always attend funerals, he would always get around people when they had losses and injury and so forth. So there was a particular situation that went on in Angola, and I decided that I would reach out to the family extensively to be sure that I would have a presence and see. So I decided that I would move early. So I moved at 8:30. I left my house and I went to this family to give them my condolences and to spend an hour or so sharing in their grief and, you know, just fellowship. When I got here, Mr. Hughes was there. But there was also a situation in the Road South area. Someone had passed away. So I decided that I would try to get there. So I said, since he was at this family, I would go to that family. So I went, I spoke with the family for about a half an hour, and then I told the family that I would be bringing some drinks and so to give support for people who come around. So I went, I got the drinks, and when I came back an hour later, I met an elderly lady at the door, and she said, put him next to Mr. Hughes on. You know, so that is something that has stayed with me, that sometimes when he wasn't visible at all, Hubert Hughes was present. And you did not mark him present, but he had a way of being marked present. And he was not an easy person to run against. But as a young man, I made a sacrifice, and I decided to contest against him. Something that, looking back now, I am glad, because I think that I've been to university, but most of what I have learned about people and about life, I have learned since I've entered into politics. It has been an education in certain areas of life that I just could never have gained any other way. I'm glad to see his brother Freddie here, because one of the things that I always marvel, every election, every single election, when I would go to the polls to prepare, he demonstrated that he had the full backing of family, he had the full backing of his wife, he had the full backing of his family. There was no way that you could undermine the late Honorable Hubert Hughes by trying to attack his family base. He had a strong family base, and Freddie Hughes, I look for him every election to give me an indication of where I stood. And he would always be number one in line, right? So, and we get along well, and he would always say to me, you know, this one is not for you. But this is the first one going in the box, you know? And we share that kind of dialogue back and forth, which a lot of people never understood, because we never really had a whole lot of rancor. But, you know, in politics, there were times when we did lash out left and right. But he was an awesome person to come up against.
And I'm glad you said that you had your little tiff with him as well. I want to take you back to a Talk on Guerrilla program in which Mr. Hughes appeared with me on my program. And he made some allegations of wrongdoing by you, Curtis Richardson, his political opponent in Road South. And this led to Mr. Hughes publicly apologizing on national radio. And I want to bring that clip now.
I, Hubert Hughes, wish to apologize to Mr. Curtis Richardson regarding words stated on 18th September 2013 on Radio Anguilla's talk program, Talk Anguilla, hosted by Mr. Keith Stonegraves. I have no evidence nor any proof of any wrongdoing by Mr. Curtis Richardson regarding the purchase of the aggregate Crimson matter. The views and all statements made on this and on other previous occasion by me in this regard were wrong and misleading, and regrettably were influenced by my reliance upon information which was unreliable and inaccurate.
That was indeed a very seminal moment. It took a lot out of the former leader to make that public apology on national radio.
Yes, and you hear it, Keith, and if you follow me closely in my political journey, it is something that I had never used again, because it's just the reverence and respect that I had for Mr. Hughes. I listened to him on several occasions, and a lot of supporters said to me, well, you know, as long as Hubert Hughes says something, you are finished. He just had a very strong appeal to people in the way that he would say things. And as I was going into that particular election, a lot of people, when I went around canvassing, they said, well, you know, this matter that Hubert is on top of you with the aggregate, we can support you if Mr. Hughes is saying this, so you need to get that clarified. So I then asked a team of people to listen out for him when he would speak. And on that particular occasion, he made a distinction in a speaking error. And I got a lawyer, Tara Carter, and John Benjamin to address him on it and for him to do that. But I had never used that as a part of my political advancement to say that Hubert Hughes, to try to defame him. I just wanted him to apologize and make it known that what he was saying was not accurate in regards to me. But Mr. Hughes and my dad were close, and there was no getting away from it. He was not an easy person to contest against.
I understand that just close, as I understand it, folks have told me, but very close.
Very close. Well, very, very. And but this is something to learn in politics, because when I lost the election, I met him about 4 or 5 days after, and he said to me, "You're gonna run again?" I say, "Well, I made a promise, if I got 200 votes, I'll come back." He said, "You will do well." Yeah? He said, "You will do well. People like you. But this election here was on top of your father." And when I came back in the next election, he met me and he said, "How do you feel you're doing?" I said, I feel I'm stronger." He said, "You're stronger, but this one here gonna be on top of Mr. Banks." So it's just to show you how well he knew his politics. He went out into the community. He tested me. He felt that people liked me and that people had a good feel about me. But he always found a way coming to the wire, down the backstretch. You were no match for Hubert Hughes. Hubert Hughes knew how to run away from you coming to election polling day. He just knew how to edge you out. And in my third election, he was just 3 or 4 months away from putting his name on the ballot. And I don't think I've prayed more than any other time, because I really did not want to face Hubert Hughes in an election for a third time. But thanks be to God, he decided that he would come out a champion, he would step aside. I feel I would have done well, but to say that I would beat Hubert Hughes is something that I just tell people for the joke of it. But quite honestly, deep down, to always try to hedge on the side of beating Hubert Hughes in an election in the Road South area was not an easy thing. So he stepped down, and I was able to come through in that particular election victorious. But the measure of the man is such, Keith, that in that particular third election that I won, I got the feeling that he didn't really put out a whole lot. I didn't feel the meter of Hubert Hughes in that particular election like I knew him from before. But the Honorable Hubert Hughes is not a representative for that area, and it speaks a lot about the legacy of Hubert Hughes, because I'm pretty sure that a lot of his support also rallying with the Doc as the leader of the party, which was also the makings of Hubert Hughes in the very early stages. The Doc will speak to that. But people respected Hubert Hughes for his political trust and his science in the politics.
Grateful for your comments. So we move to the Doc, the Honorable Premier, Dr. Webster. And your own involvement now, Dr. Webster. Mr. Hughes was the one who passed the mantle to you. The party's name was changed, and so on and so forth. Your memories, lasting memories of this great Anguillian political leader.
Well, thank you, Keith, and good afternoon to all. It's a pleasure to sit here among such an august body of Anguillians who have different generations, I can see, and certainly condolences to Mr. Freddie Hughes, brother of the late Mr. Hughes. Certainly my recollections are that he is a powerful ally, and listening to Mr. Beard and Mr. Richardson, a formidable foe. I've never had to experience that part of it, and certainly thankful for that. But certainly as an ally, I found he was very confident, he was knowledgeable, and he understood politics, as Honorable Mr. Richardson said. He understood it down to the nitty-gritties of it. He could tell you where you were strong, where you were weak, what needed to be done. And he also, I think, that because he'd been in it for so long, he understood the people of Anguilla very well, having been here, traveled abroad, come back. He had a good understanding of where things were and all. And his influence, I can tell, is still with us today and will continue to be with us because he was the backbone of this party, the AUM, and now the Anguilla Progressive Movement.
Honorable Doc Webster, how was he able, on a very personal level now, able to steer you? You know, you were totally green. Spent your time in medicine, practicing medicine, and politics came further down. How was Mr. Hughes able, anything he would have shared with you, any wise counsel that he would have left with you that still remains with you as it relates to politics and getting actively involved in politics? You're now leader of Anguilla.
Yes, certainly something I can say, you know, he said politics is about people. And, you know, if you listen to the people, then you can't go wrong. Certainly, you know, you want to hear what the people want, what you feel that would help them to move them forward. And then you have to devise the policies. And that's where he came in. He was able to, we come up with ideas, we had a vision, and discuss it with him, and he would say, this is the technical aspect of politics. And so that's what I think Mr. Richardson was mentioning earlier when he said he understood you know, politics as a science. And so he was able to then say, this is how you approach getting this done. This is how you try to make things work. If there's a certain faction of persons that you haven't been able to reach, this is how you do it. And certainly I think that was good. But you understand the genesis of my involvement in politics is that, you know, back in, well, I came in medical doctor, ENT, ear, nose, and throat as a specialist, and saw that, you know, medical system in Anguilla left much to be desired in terms of advancing. And wanted to point out to the persons in charge of how we could make things better, and I met with a lot of resistance. It was like hitting my head against a rock. And with that, you know, in talking to persons, I found that the only way that you can influence policies to get involved in politics. But my brother Sam, you know, he was the AUM representative, the candidate. Thank you, Mr. Beard. So my brother Sam was the AUM candidate in the 2010 election, and he did not win. And he would have run again in 2015. It was about January of 2014 when we had a discussion, and I had shown some interest now in getting involved in the politics in Anguilla, and he graciously decided that he would step away and allow me to take his position as the AUM candidate in District 1. Certainly I would not have become involved and run against my brother. And certainly after we had that discussion, we just talked with you know, Honorable Mr. Hughes, and he was in agreement that we could do that after several sessions of getting to understand you know, the principles that the Anguilla United Movement was formed upon in 1979 when he formed the party, and also in terms of the vision that I had for advancing. My single, you know, plank at that time was to make healthcare more accessible and better. And sitting with him, I was then able to get a broader scope of Anguilla and the politics of Anguilla, and the history of Anguilla, its relationship in terms of being overseas territory. And certainly he had his views about, you know, the relationship with the United Kingdom, and some I share, some I don't. But I guess that's why there was this this understanding between us, and I think that we spent a lot of time together. Even you know, Brother Freddie, he knows that we would sit a lot on the porch and listen to stories and also strategies. And he could display or teach you strategy. He didn't even know that you were learning this. I mean, he knew the voters list like the back of his hand. He also would talk about how when persons were removed from the voters list, whether it was inadvertent or intentional by the the technocrats. He knew who was missing off the list. He knew how to go back and find them, how to get them reinstated. And these are things that I learned over that time, and certainly I think that's what helped him to continue to win whenever he ran, and also helped us to win in the last election.
Grateful for your comments, Honorable Premier. Glenn Hodge, a resident political historian. He's been going through his various bits and pieces. Glenn, your memories, your thoughts on the late former leader.
Thank you, Pete. First of all, my condolences once again to the family members and to Brother Freddie right here. My recollection of Mr. Hughes go way back, much further than any of these here, probably before some of them were born. Certainly, I'm going to give the year, mid-60s. Mr. Hughes, my very first recollection of him was at Long Bay, coming to Long Bay when he came out from England. Mr. Hughes would say to you that Long Bay was his second home. His family originated from there on his mother's side. And I was at my aunt's house, I believe it was a Sunday afternoon, where we used to frequent as little children at the time, when he came out from England and he came down, and I remember one of his cousins saying, "That's my cousin, Hubert Hughes." And he was known, he had a nickname too. He was known as Wasi. He was known as, so when you hear about Wasi, the original Wasi was Hubert Hughes. And that meaning was a person who could not see well. And Mr. Hughes came out, and then I remember him coming frequently to Long Bay, down by us as a family. My father and him, they shared many political conversations. He drove a red Zephyr English car at the time, and so you know whenever he was in the community. And he would always be talking politics. Then it would have gone on to one memorable Sunday morning, in the height of the revolution, the St. Andrews, which was spoken about earlier. That vessel was checked, as I learned, in Santa Ground by the revolutionary leaders and the guys who were patrolling and looking at the beach. And he was accused of taking out of the off-island the St. Kitts troops which had invaded Angola. That was the rumor. They searched that vessel in Santa Ground, and I can tell you, in no time, a truckload of guys with their firearms and everything were down on Meads Bay. And you hear pop, 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 shots all over the place. The St. Andrews had come to a standstill. And they went and they searched that vessel again. So that was a little bit of introduction to the first politics, because he was a pro-Ratcher. This is something that was never kept back by Hughes himself. Rather strange in Angular politics, that in the midst of it, he let it be known that he supported the Labour Party in St. Kitts, which was Angola's biggest enemy. Right. Then we move on. 1976, Mr. Hughes would have ran for the first time, and he won his seat. He was the lone opposition in the House of Assembly to Mr. Webster, and those were the days when Mr. Webster was all powerful. Even the late Sir Emile was a member of that government, along with Teacher Albina. 1977, 1 year after that election, a motion of no confidence was passed against Mr. Webster. The members of government, for some reason, they felt that they should not have done it, and they got Mr. Hughes to move the motion of no confidence. He did. They supported it. There were 3 ministers at that time that the Constitution provided for, and in forming the other government, you had Mrs. Lake Hodge and Mrs. Idelia Gums, who were appointed as ministers, and Mr. Hughes was given the post of advisor to the chief minister. Everybody knew it was a bluff from the very beginning. However, that union, that marriage, did not last long, and by 1979, Mr. Hughes, as stated earlier, formed the Angola United Movement, and he made up with Ronald Webster, and Ronald Webster then became the leader of that party, and he contested the election. He won 6 of the 7 seats, of which Mr. Hughes was a minister, and Mr. Emile Gums, Sir Emile Gums, was the lone opposition. 1980 was the election, and there was a fallout again with Mr. Hughes. 3 ministers, Claudius Roberts, Hubert Hughes, and Mr. Webster. Some infighting took place. Minister Roberts, who was Minister of Education, was sacked. Mr. Hughes resigned. 1981, Mr. Hughes decided to go it alone. Well, back to his AUM, but only with 2 candidates, himself and Mr. Albert Hughes. He was not successful at the polls. He was defeated by one Mr. Maurice Connor. An early election again in 1984. You had Mr. Albert Hughes, John Hodge at that time retired from politics, and Mr. Albert Hughes was asked to come back and join the Anna Party, and he did so. But Mr. Hughes would have said to me, with an agreement, that Mr. Hughes, if they win the election, was going to be given a ministerial portfolio. By that time we had 4 ministers, because the Constitution would have changed in 1982. Once the election was won, and there were sufficient seats to form the government outside of Mr. Hughes, there were some hardliners within the party at the time who said, no ministerial position for Mr. Hughes. Mr. Albert Hughes said, no ministerial for him, I am not accepting any, so you don't form the government. And he insisted. Mr. Hughes then became a minister in 1984. By 1985, there was a fallout again. There was a fallout. And let me say, my position at that time, I was a strong civil servant, but I always was strong into politics, and I supported the Anna Party at the time. By 1985, there was a fallout between Mr. Hughes and the Anna Party. I think that came over the whole thing of introduction of a gambling casino on the island, the sales of land over at Shoal Bay West, right? And Mr. Hughes was sacked by the then Chief Minister, Mr. Emil Grams. So Mr. Hughes had to regroup again. And in 1989, Mr. Hughes came back, and I heard Mr. Beard say I was the AUM, but there is something to note, that there were 2 elections where Mr. Hughes did not run in the party as the AUM. It was the Angola United Party. And a few of us would meet religiously. We called ourselves the party, and Mr. Richardson is smiling. And there is where his dad came in very much. Pastor Ambrose was one of the stalwarts of the party, Mr. Benny Connor, Mr. Arundel Lewis, Stephen Richardson of West End. It was about 12 or 14 persons, and we would meet at Mr. Arundel Lewis. Something strange happened here. By that time, Mr. Webster was somewhat sidelined. And one night at a party meeting, Mr. Hughes told us that Mr. Webster will join us. And the next thing, to our surprise, Mr. Hughes stated, without informing any of us, that he's handed over the leadership to Mr. Ronald Webster as senior statesman. It didn't go down too well with many of us. We were taken by surprise. But he was a very smart politician. He felt this was going to give him more momentum. He was going to garner all the support that Mr. Webster would have had in his constituencies and make him even stronger. And he did just that. Mr. Webster was unsuccessful at the polls, and only Mr. Hughes, the 2 Hugheses, won their seats. Let me state something here. My relationship politically with Mr. Hughes was a checkered relationship.
Meaning what?
Meaning that in the early years, as I stated, I was a supporter of Anna, and Mr. Hughes decried me for supporting the Anna Party. Okay, I then became close with him post 1985, and by 1999 there was also a fallout again with Mr. Hughes. Right, so it was checkered. But I'll continue. 1994. By that time, you had the ADP was formed, and politics in Angola was changing. It was becoming more sophisticated. You're getting conventions. The Anna Party had already started, and the ADP, when they came out, they started and they made a launch with guest speakers. So we decided in the UP can't be anything less than that. And our first meeting at the Coronation Park was held, and the guest speaker there was the late Reverend Dr. Wilfred Social Hodge out of Solid. But there was something which happened at that meeting, and something that happened subsequent. At that meeting, it was at an era where the British government was speaking strongly about having its colonies, the overseas territories, going the way of accepting homosexuality. Mr. Hughes got up at that meeting that night, that very first night of launching the campaign, and he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, everybody knows that all Englishmen are homosexuals." Well, that didn't go down too well with some of us in the party. It didn't go down certainly well with the then British governor, Mr. Alan Shave. Mr. Alan Shave demanded of Mr. Hughes that he make an public apology for what was stated. The Reverend Johnny Gomes was also on the back of Mr. Hughes that he must make an apology. The next meeting was at South Hill, opposite to Mr. Hughes where the playing field is today. But we had sat in a party setting and we had asked Mr. Hughes, or stated to him that he has to make an apology. Mr. Hughes gave no indication as to what he was going to do, whether he was going to apologize or not. He stayed and he listened to all that was said. On the night of that meeting, two things happened. First, he started, "Ladies and gentlemen, the other evening I made a silly little statement over at Coronation Park, where I stated that all Englishmen are homosexuals. But ladies and gentlemen, you know and I know that all Englishmen are not homosexuals, but some are." Now, was it an apology? Up to today, I cannot answer that question. The other thing which happened at that time, I said that our politics was changing. And we knew that Mr. Hughes, once he get a mic, at times it was difficult to keep him on track to deal with the issues. So it was agreed that all speakers, all candidates would use notes and speak from notes. Mr. Hughes had his notes written on a legal size pad folder. And once he would have gone through that apology, or whatever it was, he started to speak, and he was through his notes, and about a minute or two in his notes, he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I am here in South Hill, at my hometown, and they told me that I must use notes to speak from. I will not." And he took the folder, and he threw it across the stage. I don't know how he didn't cut it total. The Reverend Gomes and Restamel Franklin, who were also on the platform. And that night I'll never forget. And what I'll say is, when he made the apology about the homosexuality, there was a British governor in Alan Shave who was attending, first time I'd ever seen a British governor attending a political rally. The minute that Mr. Hughes made a statement, that Land Rover was started and just rolled out of the area, right? So that was the Mr. Hughes, the 1994 election. We know, as Mr. Beard stated, the outcome of that was a coalition government between himself and the ADP government. Mr. Beard is gone, but I'd like to say, I know Mr. Beard had his reservations of Mr. Hughes. I was also there when the government was formed, being his chief minister, being his boss. One of the things that happened on that morning was when members of the Anguilla Democratic Party came down to the home of the Reverend John Gomes, because that's where the agreement was made. And they were speaking of doing the coalition. His votes are not yet counted. And Mr. Hughes was like, "How do you want me to form a government? I don't even know if I've won this seat." Somebody literally pulled him up and took him and said, "Come on, I think there's Reverend Gomes, and let's go here and we're going to form the government." The question was ministries. and the two big ones, as alluded to by Mr. Beard, tourism and finance. And he tossed them up, and Mr. Hughes relaxed and he said to Mr. Banks, Victor, you choose whichever one you want. And Mr. Banks chose finance, and Mr. Hughes had tourism. I could very much recall it. It was after, during that term, it went out. I was at the end of that term. Certain things happened, which I'm not going to go into, that caused myself and Mr. Hughes to against. But I want to say something on a personal note about Mr. Hughes at this point in time. I don't think Mr. Hughes had any enemies. Nobody could ruffle his feathers that bad that he would have enemies. And we had some fiery exchanges between us, directly and indirectly. However, 2019 and 2020 was some challenging years for me, medically. And 2009 too. And every time that I was hospitalized, he would make it his business to come and visit me. Sometimes you think you know who your friends are, but you really don't know. Thank you.
Thank you very much, resident historian, political historian Glenn Hart. We're certainly happy for that. I want to take you back now before we get some more inputs on the phone line. We have Brent Davis, we're trying to get up Walker Richardson, and certainly we intend to have Jodis Fincomb's Connor in here as well. But there's an exchange of correspondence between Henry Billingham, he was the then Minister for the Overseas Territories, in January, the 10th of January of 2011. And some consultants came in here to deal with the budget. In fact, he was asked to prepare 2 budgets in the same year and all of that. He had his run-ins with the British over his many years. And he had to complete these 2 budgets in 1 year before the UK could approve his budget. The government response, Henry Billingham wrote to him, and then there was the government response was done in a speech by Mr. Hughes on January 11th of 2011. And in that, looking at the notes from his speech, and a lot of time Mr. Hughes wrote his notes in his own handwriting. He wrote his own script. Many times you go to his office and you will see him writing his actual speeches. But still, when he goes to present, he puts his speech away. The PSAs and so in his ministry could not write a prepared text for him. It's nonsensical for him. He told me many times, oh, why are they writing this? I'm not going to use that. I talk from my head. But that exchange with Billingham, the UK had proposed some revisions to the budget. CM Hughes wanted to change the borrowing guidelines. The UK rejected the proposals sent by Mr. Hughes. So here's a clip we want to play for you. Of Mr. Hubert Hughes in typical combative style, an exchange of correspondence between the GOA, Government of Anguilla, and the FCO. In fact, it came at a time during the time that Governor Alistair Harrison was here, and CM Hughes had just come back from Montserrat, where he attended the funeral of the former CM of Montserrat, the former Chief Minister of Montserrat, John Osborne. So here is the Chief Minister in combative style, Mr. Controversial.
Is being exerted by them. Now, we can't blame them completely. I spoke to a governor some years ago about Britain stopping aid for Angola and for the 1st of May 2005. And the governor said Angola has enough economic resources to take care of itself. And I said, yes, we have enough economic resources, but before your very eyes, our politicians are squandering it. So the people now, the government, they supported the Angola United Front, while they were squandering to Flag Luxury, squandering to Capjaluca, squandering to Viceroy, and that was the people's government, so they cursed me. Basically now everybody's paying, and everybody has to pay, because the British government only laugh at you because you had an opportunity in a democracy where you form the government as elected members of the people to do what is the best interest of the people.
Typical Hubert Hughes. Controversial right down to the end of his time here on earth. He was always that person and not afraid to say what he wanted to say. And Freddie Hughes, Mr. Hughes, I ask you again, was the late Hubert Hughes always this kind of a way?
Definitely.
He never shied away from a challenge, from a fight. He was always in there,
And
you know,
that
going
is-
at it.
That is what encouraged me to help him go on to get better education than what we could afford here in Anguilla.
Very interesting indeed.
Yeah, because I know he would be able to put it to good use. I discovered that. And I never regretted one day.
Never regretted.
No.
Yeah. I know the leader, honorable leader of the opposition, Cora Richardson Hodge, she'll be speaking in the House tomorrow, but when Mr. Hughes passed, she described the late CM as being a forthright, astute and engaging personality, earned the respect of many persons near and far, and Mrs. Cora Richardson Hodge, the honorable leader of the opposition here in the Anguilla House of Assembly, also indicated in her short note that his contribution, that is Mr. Hughes' contribution to Anguilla, has left an indelible impression on the lives of all Anguillians and many persons all over the world. I say that to say on Thursday at 10 o'clock we'll be having the inputs, the reflections of many Caribbean leaders and international figures on a program we are doing this Thursday, I beg your pardon, at 10 o'clock. I have in fact reached out to the former Honorable Premier Victor Banks. Mr. Banks did not want to come into studio to join us, but he did in fact share with me a statement, something he intends to present tomorrow in Parliament. In fact, he gave me permission to use his advanced statement ahead of the parliamentary sitting tomorrow. So I just want to quote some areas from that particular statement issued by the Honorable Victor Franklin Banks, the former Premier of Anguilla. He says, as a parliamentary colleague, I worked with Mr. Hughes both in government and in opposition, and despite our differences on several occasions, I came to respect his fervor for his beliefs and his skill as a politician in every respect of his service. It was probably because of that fact that I facilitated his first opportunity to become Chief Minister of Anguilla in 1994. It was an opportunity that seemed unlikely, given the general belief at that time that Mr. Hughes seemed much more comfortable in opposition. His contribution to Anguilla in every role that he served will be remembered by many of us in our several ways. If I were to sum it up, my experience with Mr. Hughes, I will not seek to rewrite history, as we often do on occasions such as these, but I would simply say it was not the smoothest relationship in my political career, yet I understood his attitude, style and approach. As the member from Valley North, the Honourable Evans McNeil Rogers would put it. Continuing from his statement, Mr. Banks' statement, I'm quoting here, obviously I cannot say that he was kind to me politically, but in the arena of politics, such adversaries help to hone your own political skills. And in the wider arena of national politics in Anguilla, it is possible that if we did not have a Hubert Benjamin Hughes, we may have had to create one. On the other hand, he left a memorable mark on the people of Road South Electoral District, where he served for over 60 years and was greatly loved and admired. He lost one election in that period, and it is quite possible that if he did not choose to retire, he may have still been the representative of that constituency up until his departure in life. But love him or leave him, there is no doubt that this fallen leader will continue to be referenced in the politics of Road South and Anguilla for many years to come. This is an advanced copy of a full statement that will be delivered in the Anguilla House of Assembly tomorrow. And Mr. Victor Banks, who declined to come into studio with us this afternoon, but sent me this particular statement that he wanted me to share with the Anguillan public. Also, I got a note from the Honorable Evans McNeil Rogers. He too would have loved to come in, but he's still in quarantine. He'll be out tomorrow. He'll be speaking in Parliament tomorrow. But he sent me a note, a brief statement. And Mr. Rogers says in a statement, quoting here, "There is no doubt that Anguilla has lost a political giant and a political icon with the passing of the late Hubert Benjamin Hughes, former Chief Minister of Anguilla. Historically, he became Anguilla's Chief Minister on 3 occasions and was longest elected parliamentarian in the history of Anguilla. Not an easy accomplishment by any standards, but it is one that I believe will be around for a very long time. One may not have always agreed with his approach, attitude, and style relative to issues surrounding politics, governance, and diplomacy, but I believe that in relation to the overall development of Anguilla and its citizens, he was in line with all of our leaders, and that is, they all wanted the best for Anguilla and its citizens." Continuing a quote here from Mr. Rogers' statement, "Hubert Benjamin Hughes was a unique and special individual in many ways, and despite being political opponents, we, Hubert and I, had a very special bond, friendship, that was beyond politics." This is the statement that I got from the Honorable Evans McNeil Rogers just before the start of the program here today. I also reached out to David Carty, the distinguished former Honorable Speaker, to share some comments, and Mr. Carty respectfully declined the invitation to share on this particular program. I just wanted to set that for the record. I know some persons will be asking about that. The relationship between Mr. Carty and Mr. Hughes going back in the Anguilla House of Assembly has been a rocky, very testy one, very tight. We've known of instances even going into the legal realm of things and so on and so forth. But I did offer that invitation to Mr. Carty, and he respectfully declined, and I respectfully respect that of Mr. Carty. But I had to put that on the record so people listening can understand the extent to which I reached out to get the local politicians and other public officials in here today. Mr. Richardson, what will remain with you? What will you take away from being the opponent, being a friend of the late Hubert Hughes? What would you have learned? What 1 or 2 things would you have learned from this great man that you were still an aspiring leader and someone still involved in active politics would want to bring into your political portfolio?
Yes, well, I think it, as I said, one of the things that I have learned from Mr. Hughes, from the late Honorable Hubert Benjamin Hughes, is when it came time to campaign, he campaigned. And like you just talked about David Carty and other persons, Hubert was not an easy character when it came to saying what he wanted to say. When he was targeting the public for their support, he knew how to canvass against you. He would say some very hard things, right? So in my very first election against him, there were some very hard things that he said about me. He tried to portray me in a certain light. But I was amazed that on one Saturday, after he had a meeting the Friday night, I ran into Mr. Hughes, and he was like, "How you doing?" And it startled me for a little while, and then I said, "But man, you pumped me up so bad last night, now you ask me how I'm doing?" He says, "Son, that's politics. We are fighting for the public's interests. We are fighting for the public's outlook on election day. So we will campaign however we have to campaign to get the support. But don't take it personal." And a lot of people have not learned that over many years of politics. Some people cannot stomach it. Some people cannot deal with it. I'll talk about my father because that's my father, right? Hubert Hughes and my dad were very close. When I came out to run the very first time, Hubert Hughes knew that a very easy target in the campaign would be to say, "Here's Pastor Ambrose, supported me all my life. Now his son is running. All of a sudden Hubert Hughes is no good." So Hubert Hughes didn't spend a lot of time trying to diminish my public appeal, he just simply started to lash at my dad. He said, you know, Jim Jones, these American lifestyle bastards. And as grown as my dad was, me and my father would sit down sometimes. He said, "You understand, Hubert? You know, he was just saying these things, you know." But he was that kind of character. When he was on the field, he was on the field. But he helped me to distinguish the difference between being on the field and off the field. Some people cannot make that distinction, and a lot of people have held Hubert in their hearts, but I have not held him, and he has taught me a lot of things. Every time I ran against him and I've lost, he would meet me, he would say certain things to me, right down to the fact that we don't depend on the same people every election. Every election is a different election, and that is something that he has said to me, he has taught me to always remember that every election that you face is a different election from the last one.
Wise counsel indeed. We have on the line now from St. Martin someone who also ran against the late former Chief Minister Hubert Hughes. Brent Davis. Brent, are you with us?
Yes, good evening.
Yes, yes, good afternoon to you. Yes, go ahead with your reflection.
To the family, to Chinama and the rest of the family, and to the Anguilla population. Today is a very distinguished day, and it's a pleasure for me to be on this panel with a very distinguished group of men. My life too has been impacted tremendously by the life of Mr. Hubert Hughes, the late Honorable Hubert Hughes. In fact, I gave him the full credit for my political awareness and my love for politics. In fact, growing up in a boyfriend community, I never really knew much about the father of the nation per se. When I got involved in politics, Mr. Webster was already out of the active political scene. So my whole political career was based upon the views and ideas and suggestions of Hubert Hughes in particular. In fact, from a very young age, teenage years, I used to listen to him. Every meeting he had, I was there. His knowledge of global affairs, in fact, led me to commit one of the few crimes I did, was stealing a Jackson book from teacher Enid in road school. You know? I took that book and I looked up every time I would hear him call a country name. I would go into that Jackson book and I would find that country, find the capital, and that made me very interested in global affairs as well. So I attribute most of that, my political career to Mr. Hughes. If it wasn't for him in particular, you know, I don't think I would have, my love for politics would have been this strong. So I decided in 2014 to contest the election for the first time, because my Mr. Hughes had a lot of great ideas nationally. His focus was more nationally. Growing up in the village, I was very involved from a very tender age in most, all of the community affairs in the village, from sports and community development. And I felt that he didn't focus too much on the district. His focus was more on Anguilla. And I decided that I wanted more for the district of Road South. And only 2013, I went to,
2003. 2003. Yeah, you're talking about 2003, 2004.
I decided with one of my main political advisors, no one wanted to run against Hubert Hughes that election, the 2005 election. He trashed just about all his opponents in the district over the last 20 years. And most people felt like, yeah, they had enough of it, and he was about to go into that election uncontested. So I decided with one of my political advisors around, I remember the story clearly, around 5:30 at evening, I decided that day I'm going to run. And I said to my partner, go down my local shop and tell the people that I wasn't against Hubert Hughes. And within a half an hour, the word spread, and you had about 15 people deciding that they're going to run too. And out of those 15, most of them dropped out, and I think only Curtis and Mr. Alan Gott remained in that 2005 election. So I can say that, like Curtis was saying, we learned a very harsh lesson in politics. I think unfortunate for me in that I came up against it twice. And it was very, very, I learned a lot. You know, as Curtis was saying, he was not an easy political person. He was very astute, very smart, knew the district. And in fact, when I went to him, when I decided to run again, I went to him and said, Mr. Hughes, I'm going to run. I'm not running against you, but I'm going to lay the foundation for my political career. And he said, man, young fella, I know you, man, you're a smart little fellow. And man, your whole family doesn't support me, nobody gonna vote for you. And, you know, and I knew that. So I'm like uncles, my aunts, you know, the majority of my family was strongly supporting him. So, you know, I said, you know, I'm not running against you per se. I'm going to lay the foundation for it. And he said, young man, go ahead. I know you're a bright little fella, and I think you can do good. So, and the other time was to say to me in person, during the election, again, as Curtis was saying, he's very strategic. He knew how to win an election. And I'm not hearing you, right? So in case I'm going over, just let me know.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hello?
Yeah, you got another minute or so. Go ahead.
Right, so he knew, he was very strategic. He knew the people in the district. He knew what to say, when, where, and how. And I think I can say that I would have not been as politically savvy as I am today if I didn't run against somebody like him. And it helped me along the way in my quest to help the people of Anguilla. He had a strong love for the people of Anguilla. And I too would continue that fight for the people of Anguilla as a whole. And I can say that he lived a good life. And I think he influenced a lot of people in Anguillan politics, especially in the western areas, the Floyd Point, South and West End, and throughout Anguilla. And his legacy will remain for eternity, will always be a figure in Anguillan politics. And I am grateful to have known him. I am grateful to learn from him. And I will cherish the moments that I spent around him and the things that I learned from him, and hope one day that, you know, it can help me in my political quest to help and serve the people of Anguilla.
Mr. Brent Davis, thank you very much indeed for your time, sir. Thanks for your contribution.
Thank you.
And as you heard there from both Mr. Richardson and all the other speakers here today, that the late Hubert Hughes was very savvy, very wily and savvy political leader. And his savviness comes out here in a Talk Anguilla program, in 2014, which I prompted him to give me some insight into 1 year before the 2015 election. This is what he had to say.
Let me put the question directly, Chief. Will you or will you not be a candidate, God's willing, in the next general election?
The candidates for the next election have not yet been finalized. At that time, everybody will know who is running and who's not running.
Everybody, including Hubert Hughes.
Everybody, including me.
So there's no disclosure at this time as to who will make up the candidates for the AUM in the next
election. It is not
election.
politically expedient for us to breach our programs without proper thought and consideration.
And that thought and consideration is actively underway.
On the way.
Okay, all right. So an announcement will come
At the right time.
At the right time? When will be that right time?
Well, the right time is when we decide.
Political savviness at its best. You're a wily political leader. Just listening to that comment, Dr. Webster. I see you nodding your head, but there is the typical mastery of the political dynamics and understanding. So savvy and so wily in his response to that question, and those questions I put to him there. Just that was 1 year into the 2015 general election, but he wasn't prepared to give away anything, any part of his strategy. Dr. Webster.
Well, I mean, you heard Mr. Richardson say earlier that, you know, up until close to the election, he didn't know who he would be running against. And that was to keep him off balance, you know, because it's certainly, unless you know who your opponent is, it's difficult to strategize properly. And I think it did help, you know, significantly. We didn't win any of the seats in 2015, but I think it set us up for 2020. We knew what needed to be done, how to overcome the deficiencies that we had, and certainly you've seen the results of this election. And certainly, you know, Mr. Hughes, though, I must say that he was a leader. And he was a leader's leader.
Yes, good afternoon, Josephine.
What he did was he
yes, okay,
he gave you that confidence that it could be done, but he also gave you the tools to do it with.
Yes,
and I think that's what, when he embraced you, you knew that he embraced you fully. It wasn't, you know, the support was not just, you know, superficial. It was all in. And I'm sure you've heard him say that over time. You know, I remember when it came to choose a leader for the Angola United movement, after he decided that he wasn't going to run, you know, he basically, you know, we had an election among the members of the party, and you know, I was elected to be the leader. But it only could come with his, you know, with his support. And then at the changeover in November 15 of 2014, it was a full-throated, you know, handover of passing the baton. And I think that helped us to stay focused, stay together, and you know, we remained the party that he had built. And then, even though the name changed, it was with his certainly his approval. And I think that it allowed us to broaden the base, to extend the tent so that other persons can join in. And as you can see, you know, that's what happened with the Angola Progressive Movement, coming from the Angola United movement that Mr. Hughes had so ably led for many, many years.
I want to go back to James Freddie Hughes, the late Hubert Hughes' older brother. I'll take that. I'll go back to Mr. Hughes in just a bit. But I have on the line now from St. Thomas someone who was pretty close, very close, to the late former Chief Minister. Served as his personal legal advisor. Served as his personal legal advisor in the person of Josephine Gomes Connor. And of course, you heard earlier that Mr. Hughes was also very close to Mrs. Gomes Connor's father, the Reverend Johnny Gomes. So we want to go to St. Thomas and say a very good afternoon now to Josephine Gomes Connor to give your reflections on the late Honorable Hubert Hughes. Josephine? Are you with us, Josephine? Give us share your memories on the passing of someone who you knew very well, served as his personal legal advisor.
Opportunity. Every opportunity I get to reflect on former Chief Minister Hughes really can go off into so many different angles. Of course, you would know that I am, by comparison, a younger when compared to the experience and the number of years of Mr. Hughes. He literally could have been my father. So my introduction into politics, so to speak, I think would have started perhaps just after, perhaps a year after I had completed my legal studies and had done my LEC in Trinidad. So just coming off the cusp of being called to the bar, I remember that just after that would have been 1995 that I would have been called to the bar. And in 1996, I recall that Chief Minister Hughes invited me to join his delegation, which would have at that time been essentially more in the nature of like what the yearly meetings in London were. And I remember that he received some chastisement, I would say, from members of the opposition at the time that he should be seeking, to have essentially this young lawyer just off the bat to accompany him to such an important meeting. And I would have to say perhaps at that time, unless he knew something that I didn't, that perhaps I would have been trading essentially on the legacy of my own father. Everyone knows, when it came to the whole aspect of the kind of breaking from the colonialism, even within the Methodist Church, that he was one of the 7 persons who led that campaign, and essentially not just the campaign, but led the breaking of the Methodist Church from the English compartment into the Methodist Church of the Caribbean and the Americas. And I would hasten to think that perhaps Chief Minister Hughes, as he then was probably looking at that kind of revolutionary spirit from the family that I came from. But I appreciated that very first foray, I would say, into what the deep relationship between the UK and Gwilla was about. And it really is something that you have to experience, I would say, to understand what colonial rule and colonialism and the little things, the little trappings that surround that tense relationship between what would have been, our colonial territories and the UK. And I believe that would have started a journey in which I began to appreciate what Mr. Hughes was really about. And so when I often think of him and reflect on him, one of the things that I think that we can all remember, that in so many of his speeches, he would refer to, the African leaders, Kwame Nkrumah and Biko, and a lot of those African leaders. And I began to appreciate that here was Mr. Hughes growing up and studying in the UK at a time when these African leaders were leading revolutionary fights for breaking from the chains of colonialism. And so I can well imagine that this informed not just his thinking, but I think was really the catalyst for what he wanted ultimately for Anguilla. And so many persons, I've listened even to 1 or 2 members of your panel, and referring how often he would be what they consider breaking from certain of the alliances, political alliances on the ground. But from what I in my relationship and understanding from Mr. Hughes, was that there was an urgency as far as he was concerned, that every action on them in a comfort zone of just existing in this relationship. I often think when you analyze, really, it rubbed against his very conscience, because he was not in politics simply to move from the one year to another, and a few little trappings and a few of the handouts that come under this relationship of colonialism. For him, I saw it, and I saw that urgency, that this had to be about a march towards one solitary goal. And those who did not share that, as far as he was concerned, if he had to break from that, he was prepared to do that, because he always sought to align with his conscience. And so, you know, I absolutely enjoyed working with Mr. Hughes. I think for me, the epitome of when you understand a leader whom you serve is that if you are thrown out in a discussion with anyone, that you should be able to know and predict what your own leader, or how your own leader would respond, not necessarily with the flair or how that person, you know, would respond, but with the principles of what that leader stood for. And so I think that in the relationship, certainly, that I developed with Mr. Hughes, there was really, certainly on my part, a huge admiration where his principles, you know, never wavered. When it came to corruption, I'm sure, you know, Keystone, you would recall how Mr. Hughes was adamant that corruption, and when you talk about corruption, not just from the narrow window of whether it's fraud or it's money missing, but for him, the very essence of corruption also went to whether your actions went against the interests of your own people. And often I think that when he would refer to corruption, he's not just, you know, he wasn't just talking about, you know, the dollars and cents of particular transactions, but it was the very heartfelt feeling on his part that when you acted against the interests of your people, that, you know, you really betrayed your own, and he had no tolerance for that.
So,
And so I can well appreciate that, you know, when, and I think, I venture to say that when it came to something like that, the British had to step back. They had to fall back. Because, one, they could never point in his 60-year career as a politician to even the smidgen, even the fumes of corruption never happened. And I think that when we reflect, and particularly for politicians and those persons who are thinking of politics as perhaps something that they aspire to, I would point them to that one solitary positioning of Mr. Hughes. There was not even the breath that one could allege of corruption on his part. And I think it worked to the benefit of Anguilla in that oftentimes very tense relationship with the British. Because they knew that when they came to that discussion, there was nothing, and I can assure you that the British, as I have seen, have a very unique way that if for one moment they feel that they may have an upper hand on someone in any particular way, I believe it is fair to say that in in the relationship, the British are by no means afraid to utilize those things to their advantage.
So in 60 seconds,
When it came to Mr. Hughes, there was always a certain deference that had to be given on that score. But you know, I could go on and
yeah,
on.
no, Josie, our time is running out, and I want to bring in another good friend of his, Walcott Richardson in St. Martin. So, in 60 seconds, what would be your lasting memory of the late former Chief Minister Hubert Hughes? 60 seconds.
I would say that he had a strong vision, and his vision was ultimately that Anguilla had to consider sooner rather than later the path of independence. I would say that for a person who understood the subtleties of colonialism, who understood what it was to be a black man leading a country, that he would want nothing more than to see Anguilla and its people riding the crest of their own self-determination. That's my memory. I think I would tender.
Thank you so very much, Josephine Gomes-Connor, former personal legal advisor to the late Honorable former Chief Minister Hubert Hughes. Josie, thank you so very much for sharing. Mr. James Freddie Hughes, we'll get a comment from you. Thank you so very much. On the family, his wife, teacher Norma, how is the family keeping after his passing, while we go to the line and we try to get Walcott Richardson in? The family, especially his wife, how is teacher Norma keeping, and the rest of the family following his passing?
During his illness, Norma, she suffered because she was with him all the way, and she used to cry when she see him suffering. I used to visit every night. After his passing, Norma seemed to feel better because you know he's out of his suffering, which eventually would have happened, and there's nothing could have been done.
Welcome. Yes, okay, this radio.
Nothing could have been done about it.
Therefore,
she's much more satisfied now.
Okay.
And all the rest of the family.
The program, okay, hold the line, hold the
Nephews,
line.
nieces, brother and sister, we are all satisfied with what has happened because we knew it was eventually coming.
All right, the late Hubert Hughes passed away May the 7th at the age of 87. We think we can go to the telephone line. We have the former Honorable Minister, Walcott Richardson, who served with Mr. Hughes in government, on the line from St. Martin. A very good afternoon to you, sir.
Good afternoon, Mr. Keith. Fortunately, I'm not hearing you too well.
Okay, we're hearing you well, so we just want you to share with us for a brief moment your reflections on the passing of the former former political leader of Anguilla, the Honorable Hubert Benjamin Hughes. Yes, go ahead and share your reflections with us. Thank you.
I think that many have spoken already, and there's nothing much more that I can add than to endorse the position of several, that Mr. Hughes was a man of integrity, and that that he wanted to be effective in all the rest of the day. Those who kind of showing a difference, it was because they could not live up to their standard. And I believe that that was the hallmark of his political career, that there must be integrity, there must be honesty, there must be decency, and that corruption should not form part of any of his administration. In the early years, it was difficult for him to have put the party together to run government. He had always been forming coalitions, and they couldn't last as such because there was always something that them to his standard, and they would break up. I could recall the last time that was really something that he couldn't stomach, if I may put it that way. He went all out to ensure that the next time he'll form a government with his own people, his own full slate, and not have to go into a coalition. So it was in 2010, for the first time, as I would recall, my history might not be as good as some of the others, but it's the first time that I think he formed the government with a complete slate of his own. And at the end of that period, he retired.
So what would be your lasting memory of Mr. Hughes?
Oh, my lasting memory is that he stood for justice. He looked forward for his people to be liberated, because in his opinion, the colonial system have not given us the kind of freedom. Hello?
Yes, go ahead. I'm listening.
The kind of freedom that he envisioned that a people should have. And that the path forward was independence. But it must be noted that he did not promote independence as a solution for everything. And that we will still have problems. And that we could not go without being first given economic independence. I believe that he was leading up to the path of demanding reparation. And his idea of reparation, as well as mine, it's not that monies must be paid into the coffers of government, but that the country must be established in a manner, the infrastructure must be well, the ports, airports, harbors, schools, hospitals, etc., should be well established and modernized. And that is their responsibility. Now, reparation is a matter of compensation, so to speak, for the disadvantages that you have faced them. And the kind of treatment we ancestors, and I don't want to say that they suffered and we did suffer. We suffered because we suffered. There's no legacy of suffer that we have to inherit on that. So I could and would remember that Mr. Hughes stood in the gap for the people in order for them to move forward. He has made a stage for those who come after. If they understood or understand, if they understand what his philosophy was all about, they can play the part that is required to put on ground. Now you know that the British would always say, if you want more autonomy, you have to set your timetable for independence. We don't come back. But our timetable setting for independence is your compensation to help us in that direction. And we need to discuss this. We need to debate this. We need to educate our people for this. And one of the drawbacks happens to be that we can never come unified. Just because one side says and the other side is not in power, there's opposition. And that should not be. I cannot recall this has to be unified.
I want to thank you so very much, Honorable Walcott Richardson, for your time. We are out of time here in the program, but we were very happy that we got you today. So all the best, and stay safe and stay healthy. Thanks for sharing your thoughts.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you, and thank you for having me.
Thank you very much. All right, we're going to go around very quickly here in studio. The Honorable Curtis Richardson is still here with us, former Minister of Government. Our Honorable Premier is also with us, and of course the brother, older brother of the late Hubert Hughes, James Freddie Hughes, is here with us. So we will send it to Mr. Richardson. Your closing, very quickly, closing thoughts or reflections on Hubert Hughes, the man and his politics.
Yes, well, just in closing, Keith, I want to thank Mr. Hughes for his contribution to the people of Road South, and more so to the people of Anguilla. He has taught me to have a broad back. I am involved in politics still currently, and it is because I ran against Mr. Hughes that I'm able to stand some of the brutality of politics. I have a better understanding and appreciation of people, and I am thankful for the fact that even though we were opponents, there were times when he would meet me, he would share with me, he would help me to navigate some of the thoughts that I had as a young man relative to politics. So I thank God for his life, for his contribution. He is someone that I look up to in politics. You have to understand that he was elected 3 times. The most times he served as the leader of Anguilla over the many years of politics, and that says something about him. He also, as some people highlighted, spent a lot of years in opposition, and as the Honorable Premier highlighted, sometimes he was happy to lose to come back a champion. So we thank God for his life, and we will go forward and carry the baton and the mantle on from him.
Thank you very much. Mr. Hughes, James Freddie Hughes, one quick final comment from you on this whole observance, the respect, the reflection on your brother's life. Very briefly, because I know you have to leave as well.
Well, if at any time, in my opinion, he would say something that I don't agree with, and I would try to correct him on it, he would say, "You could only teach me about sailing, you can't teach me anything about politics." So, never mind how you interpret it, I know what I'm saying. So I'll always remember that he was a man who was a politician, and I was a sailor.
The politician Hubert Hughes, the sailor Freddie Hughes. Mr. Hughes, I want to thank you so very much for taking time out to come in and sit with us here in studio and talk to us about your brother, sharing some very personal, intimate bits and pieces about your brother. My condolences on behalf of my family and myself to the Hughes family at this time. Thank you so very much for sharing, sir.
You're welcome, sir.
And finally, we've left the Honourable Premier for last. A quick closing comments for you, reflections on the passing of the former leader, Hubert Benjamin Hughes. Dr. Webster.
Yes, I thank you for this opportunity, Keith. Mr. Hughes was larger than life. And you can see even in death, he's able to unite people. He's brought, family, he's brought political allies and opponents together in this studio, and that's what I remember him for, that he could unite people for a common purpose. And that's what I appreciate about it. I want to thank his family for sharing him with us, with the people of Anguilla, because they sacrificed, I think, him not being there, or his having to, lead the country, and sometimes at their detriment, because they would bear the brunt of some of the attacks, because he stood firm for what he believed. And so I just want to say, to his family, thank you for his service. Teacher Norma, his wife, his children, the Honorable Hayden Hughes and Greg Hughes, Brother Freddie, and the rest of the family. And I think the whole of Anguilla owes him a debt of gratitude which we can never repay, and it will be good when he sits in the chamber of the House of Assembly, where he served for so many years, so that we can all reflect on his greatness. And I want to thank you for this opportunity, Keith.
Thank you very much, Honorable Premier Dr. Ellis Webster, bringing us to the end of this round table, reflecting on the late Honorable Chief Minister Hubert Benjamin Hughes, the man and his politics. A reminder coming up on Thursday morning at 10 o'clock. We'll be going to the wider Caribbean and internationally, and you'll hear the comments and reflections of persons from the wider Caribbean and internationally on the late leader on Thursday morning at 10 o'clock. We'll see you then. Thanks a lot for listening, and thank you all who've been here with us: Eddie Beard, Glenn Hodge, Honorable Curtis Richardson, Honorable Premier Dr. Webster, and of course the older brother of the former leader, James Freddie Hughes, Josephine Gumbs, Honorable Walcott Richardson, and Brent Davis for sharing here with us today, plus also the comments, the statement submitted by the former leader, Reverend Minas Hodgeswell, the former leader, Honorable former Premier Franklin Victor Banks, and the Honorable Evans McNeil Rogers, who also shared with me their thoughts, sending in scripts and with their comments. Thank you all so very much.
Thank you, Keith.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Where are we going?